she cried. Ha ha! So that's your little game, is it? You look after yourself all right, don't you? You make sure you've got a nice cup of morning tea, but you didn't think to bring one to your poor old grandma. I always knew you were a selfish pig. Hand it over, George.
No, cried Mrs. Cranky. No, Mother, don't. That's not for you.
Now you're against me too, shouted Grandma. My own daughter, trying to stop me having my breakfast, trying to starve me out. Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman, and he smiled sweetly.
Of course it's for you, Grandma, he said. You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot.
Don't think I won't,
Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out a huge horny hand for the cup.
No, no, Grandma, George cried out, pulling the cup away. You mustn't. You're not to have it. Give it to me, boy, yelled Grandma.
Don't, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's Georgie's Marvellous.
Everything's George's round here, shouted Grandma. George this, George that. I'm fed up with it.
And she snatched the cup. She snatched it out of little George's hand and carried it high up out of reach. Drink it up, Grandma, Mr. Cranky said, grinning hugely. Lovely tea. No, the other two cried. No, no, no. But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed everything that was in it. Mother, wailed Mrs. Cranky, you've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvellous Medicine No. 4, and look what one tiny spoonful did to that little brown hen. But Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth and nose and ears, and she was beginning to whistle. This is going to be interesting, Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. Now you've done it, cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. You've cooked the old girl's goose. I didn't do anything, Mr. Cranky said. Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it. A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was still shooting out of Grandma's head and whistling as it came. She'll feel better after she's let off a bit of steam, Mr. Cranky said. She's going to blow up, Mrs. Cranky wailed. The boiler's going to burst. Stand clear, said Mr. Cranky. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill it hurt his ears. Call the fire brigade, cried Mrs. Cranky. Call the police! Man the hose pipes! Too late, said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. Grandma, shrieked Mrs. Cranky. Mother, run to the drinking trough and put your head under the water. But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She'd started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. Watch this, George, shouted Mr. Cranky, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. Watch what happens when someone's had 50 spoonfuls instead of one. Very soon, Grandma was back to normal height. Stop, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's just right. But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another moment, she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. How do you feel, Mother? Asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression it always had. Her eyes, no bigger now than little keyholes, were blazing with anger. How do I feel? She yelled. How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant a minute ago and suddenly you're a miserable midget? She's still going, shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully. She's still getting smaller. And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a pencil, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and she cried, How do I stop her getting smaller still? You can't, said Mr. Cranky. She's had 50 times the right amount. By then, Grandma was the size of a matchstick and still shrinking fast. A moment later, she was no bigger than a pin, then a pumpkin seed, then... Where is she? Cried Mrs. Cranky. I've lost her. Hooray, said Mr. Cranky. She's gone. She's disappeared completely, cried Mrs. Cranky. Well, that's what happens to you if you're grumpy and bad-tempered, said Mr. Cranky. Great medicine of yours, George. George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I find you? But she calmed down quite quickly. And by lunchtime she was saying, "Oh, well, I suppose it's all for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance round the house, wasn't she?" "Yes," said Mr. Cranky. "She most certainly was." George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few brief moments, he had touched with the very tips of his fingers the edge of a magic world. Goodbye.